So try any, okay, let's just launch into it. You'll see that I've talked about trying to look at the expanse of what grief is, simply to look at what could we be, when could we experience grief? In other words, it's a pretty broad topic, and I'm sure all of us have been touched by it one way or the other at various times in our lives. One of the challenges, I think, for us is to recognize that, pardon me, grief is, yes, it's normal, but sometimes our experience of it is not normal. And that's really where those of us who are counselors come in, to supporting someone through that part of the journey that is very difficult. And for those of us who are grieving, that's the time where we may need a little help along the way. So, okay. Let's see if my little magic button will work. Okay, okay, this is all on your page, so I won't actually waste time with it further. What is it? These are the definitions that I found most useful. Normal and necessary journey we embark on when something we have valued no longer exists. Heavy oppressive sadness, I think we can all relate to that. There are a couple of writers differentiate between grief and mourning. To me that's kind of splitting hairs. They talk about grief being the internal experience and mourning the external. I don't know, I find grief really covers it all. If we use that, we all pretty much know what we're talking about. So I think the most obvious cause of grief that any of us would identify would be death of someone that we value. But of course, any other losses in our life, we could be grieving them. And these are often the ones that I would call the sort of hidden grief, where people don't realize that we are actually grieving and really hurting from the loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, the loss of a home, the loss of a pet, really losses. Anything that we valued and that is no longer there would be something that could trigger grief in us. The term that I put in, loss of dreams, which is kind of like, how do we do that? Well, if something we've always wanted and dreamt about having, being, doing, going, that somehow suddenly becomes impossible. This is not going to happen. You know, my wish to be an astronaut definitely flew out the window about age 25. No, I didn't have it, but that's okay. Had I had that wish, that could have been something that I would have grieved, because it was the sort of thing that I always thought about doing. So dreams that actually were never there, but they were there, they existed as a dream, and that loss is something we grieve. Unfulfilled intentions is one term that I find very useful to capture why we would grieve something. If we have an intention to be successful in our career, and at some point we say, well, you know, I'm really not doing what I'd hoped to do, that is an intention that we've had that has been unfulfilled, and that could be a potential cause, trigger for grief. An unfulfilled intention we'd have in the case of death would be something like, our intention is that Granny is always going to be there for me. And of course it's unrealistic, we know that, but we still have that loss when Granny actually passes. So, okay, grief as a counterpart to love. A lot of philosophers will talk about you can't really expect to go through life without grieving if you expect to have love in your life. In other words, we need it, and actually I think Brown says this as well, the greater your love, the greater your capacity for grief, and similarly, the greater your depth of sadness, the greater your capacity for love. Which sounds great, but it's pretty awful when we're in that place of grieving and pain. So, you know, then the philosophy is probably not that helpful. Right. Doesn't solve it, right? Okay. The other thing, though, the point that I put at the bottom of that slide is that we can grieve something that was never there. So again, that goes back to the unfulfilled intentions and the dreams. But the sort of grief that many of people encounter is for something that kind of should have been there and wasn't. So the child of a neglectful or abusive parent can be in massive grief, especially when that parent passes, because that absolutely puts paid to their hopes and dreams for that relationship. So grief is not necessarily something we had. It can be something that kind of should have been there, or we wanted to be there, and now it's absolutely gone. So, okay. This is one of my favorite pieces of information in working with grief and with pretty much any other negative emotion. If you look at it, this scale is a list of the primary human emotions that we're all capable of feeling simply by virtue of being human. In other words, we're all capable, in the right circumstances, of having enthusiasm, cheerfulness, anger, grief, etc. Okay, so that's good. That's kind of what our human potential is. And for all of us, if you're on somewhere on the upper end of that scale, life is good. You know, pretty much mostly we're happy, we're cheerful, we're good, we have energy, life's good. Obviously the lower end of the scale is where none of us want to kind of live or stay. And that is the area where we tend to lack energy, life is difficult, life is challenging. Now grief, you will see, is pretty much low on the scale. It's pretty much down there. Now into this definition of grief, you would include all your other negative sadness kind of conditions. Your depressions would fit with that. So it's pretty much that level where one has, by definition, very little energy, very little motivation, profound feelings of sadness. It's low down the scale, which means that if one is chronically in that condition, in other words, that's pretty much where we're living, it's pretty much hard work to get ourselves out of it. And again, any of you who had that experience would know how difficult it can be. The good thing is that if we are at a higher level generally on this scale, in other words, pretty much life's okay, you know, it's not wonderful, but it's okay. Then when we do hit grief because of a loss, we will go absolutely down to that grief level. However, because we've kind of got that positive energy of sort of default mode is at a higher level, we're going to get out of it a little quicker. None of which is helpful at all if you just happen to be right down there. However, conceptually it might be. I'm going to come back to the whole, the stages of grief. It's in there somewhere, because that's usually what people know best about, you know, what's meant to happen and doesn't always work. So, okay, I want to propose a notion that some grief can be traumatic. And I think this is borne out by a lot of writers and by the psychiatric profession as well. Why does this even matter? I think it's simply, again, drawing attention to what we already know, which is it's a matter of degree. As to grief, we get so-called normal grief. And again, it's debatable as to what actually that is. I think that's the grief that we're okay with. And then the grief that is traumatic, overwhelming, too much for us, the extreme grief. And that will be the other end of the spectrum. Now that I would actually say probably would fit my definition of trauma, as in something where you've got a profound, unfulfilled intention, you've got a meaning that you've attached to this loss that is very significant. As in, I will never be happy again because my brother died. That's pretty profound. As compared to the same event, if I say my brother died, it's really sad, and I will always love and miss him, I'm in a different place. So it's what is the meaning for me of this event, as to whether that becomes an actual trauma or not. And trauma, by my definition, is an event, a loss that has never been fully examined. And why don't we fully examine it? Because it's too darn painful. So that is where we need time to process and possibly to actually do the work in counseling, which can get us through. It's kind of like some of what we do in counseling is a fast forward of what is actually a normal process and that will happen anyway. However, if we don't really want to go the slow, painful route, we can actually sometimes move to a less painful place by going more quickly. Okay, so what else? Okay, now I get even more fun with my little diagram. Again, I think this is relevant though just for our understanding of grief and what it is and what it is not. I think you can differentiate grief as simply sadness over a loss. You can then look at it, there's an overlap with what we would ourselves describe as a mental condition such as depression or anger over the loss of whatever it is. And again, mental health has a spectrum. Am I sad or am I depressed? You know, am I sad or am I clinically depressed? Well, depending on who you talk to, you might get a different answer. I have some comments on that too coming. And then the grief that is actually a trauma as well. In other words, something that really takes our attention, has a profound negative meaning and experience for us, and that frankly does not just go away. You know, the good old time heals and all that, yeah, but not always, right? So when it doesn't, it may be because this is really more well described as trauma rather than grief. I think the semantics for me are actually somewhat arbitrary though, so having said all that, I'm now going to say, nah, forget it anyway. Okay. If we go into the mental health side though, you can get into in my opinion, I don't want to get silly about this, but it can be overwhelming because the views of the psychiatric profession is that you can put a lot of grief into a whole pile of diagnoses. In fact, there's probably a whole bunch more than I actually pulled out there. And if you go to a medical doctor when you are grieving, you will very likely get a diagnosis and a prescription, because that is what they have to offer. It's not that that's a bad thing, but I think there are other ways of processing grief. So diagnosis, I think, is useful. Sometimes people who are suffering from these conditions will say, oh, now I know I actually have a major depressive disorder. That's why I'm feeling so awful. Okay, if that's helpful, great, go for it. If you want medication, great, go for it. It can be helpful. But it really is, to my mind, it's helpful as a descriptor of what you're actually experiencing, and not a lot else. Because again, it doesn't magically take it away, although people can get a lot of relief from medication, short term. Okay, yeah, some of the terminology really amazed me. There's not normal bereavement. Okay, so what is normal bereavement? And the ICD 9 and 10, not a mental disorder. Okay, who knows? Okay. This is the viewpoint I like to take, which is the person-centered one. So whether it's me or it's anyone else, anyone I'm working with, my family or friends, what is going on for you? I think that's the bottom line. What does it matter? What is happening for you? Well, you know I shouldn't be grieving because my friend died 5 years ago, but I really am depressed about it. Okay, that's all I need to know. You know, you can call it what you want. My truth as an individual is the truth. And I think that's really helpful for us, whether we're helping professionals or we're supporting a family member, or whether we're grieving ourselves. What is going on for us? No one else in the world knows exactly what's going on for me. So others may say, well, you should be over it by now. Really not helpful. Or, you know, you need to grieve more, or whatever it is. But they don't know. So each of us has our own unique experience, and I find that most useful to work with myself or anyone else. So, okay. And we will heal if we give them the space to do it. Okay. Stages of grief. I don't want to shoot down everyone. Oh, psychiatry, oh, da. But again, I certainly when I went to school, this was, hey, this is what happens, you grieve and you have anger and bargaining and blaming and all that, and boop, then you pop out the other side and you're good. Now again, I think this is in no way a criticism of Kubler-Ross. She did fabulous work, and her intention never was to make this set in stone, as in we bounce from one to the other. If you look at the stages, the different stages of stages at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that she talked about in her work with terminally ill people, how that they would work through, she first called this the stages of receiving catastrophic news. Then she talked about the 5 stages of dying. Then she said, okay, the 5 stages of loss. And suddenly, I don't think with a lot of help from her, it morphed into stages of grief. And now we're all going to go through this. So I think for all of us, it's good to just bear in mind that while those emotions are very common for any of us suffering a loss, they are not sequential, nor are they essential, nor are they in any way predictable. I think, to my mind, the best thing we can say is if we've suffered a significant loss, we're going to have some strong, probably negative emotions. That's it. That are probably going to be changeable because, you know, we've kind of been, our equilibrium has been disrupted by what's going on. So, yeah, but please don't try and push anyone through this, or yourselves, through this kind of sausage machine. Okay. It's not how it works. Yeah. Okay, so if we are supporting someone who's grieving, there's a lot of things we can do. Again, whether we're doing it as a professional or as a family member or friend. Really, it's the simplest things. We often feel like we need to talk, we need to say, we need to do something. Listening to where they're at is such a gift to anyone. How are you doing? Wow. Then they can say, well, I'm okay, I just need to go shopping today. Or, well, blah, and they let us know. And that's great if we are okay to just listen to it and let them do it. Acknowledge. Acknowledge the loss. This is something that I've heard from many people, including my own family members who've suffered losses, that when people don't acknowledge that you have had a loss, it's worse. So, you know, the sort of thing where you think, I don't know if these people in this group that you're not that close to know about the death I've had. Well, that's a very uncomfortable position to be in, because it's like there's a barrier to your communication with them. And if they just say, hey, I'm sorry to hear about your brother, that's all they need to say. You know, but then you know that they know, and then you can move on. Whereas if they just say, oh, how was your summer? Well, it gets very awkward all around. So acknowledging that without getting into it, we don't have to lay on the other person our feelings about their loss or what we think they might be feeling. Because that, again, that can actually make it more difficult for them. But just, I'm sorry to hear about whatever it is, you know, that loss. And then leave it to them. Watch them, listen to them. Let them decide, do they want to tell you about it or talk about it, or do they just want to, yep, I'm okay for now, and off they go. So, specific help, the how you're doing, I like, because it's very, but beyond their, and that's beyond their acknowledgement. So not just, hey, how you doing? Not so good. I'm sorry to hear about your loss. How are you doing? Would be great. Okay, don't evaluate. It's so hard for us not to do that, right? Tell them what they should be doing, thinking, feeling. It's, well, you know, I'm sure if you just take it easy, you'll be fine. Well, I'm sure you'll feel much better next week, or, you know, you should not be doing any, oh, it's scary, right? Because mostly people don't really want to hear that. If they say, what do you think I should do? And they look at you, well, probably you can say, well, what, you know, have you thought of anything yet? Or what would you like to do, right? Mostly they don't, oh, I don't know what to do. But they're not really asking us. They're actually just saying, I'm a little confused. So, okay. Don't talk too much about your own loss. This is a real no-no. And again, sometimes we tend to do it when we're sort of feeling a little awkward, and what do we say? As in, oh, well, yeah, when my uncle died, I did blah, 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 blah. It's probably not what they need to hear at that point. So, yeah. So, yeah. Okay. I haven't put a lot more than that, but I think really if you can do any of those, you've pretty much got it made, right? Particularly the listen and acknowledge. Okay. Self-help. How do we do it ourselves when we're the griever? Allow yourself time, balance your time. A lot of this is about the immediate, short-term response to a loss. Get some support. Pretty much the kind of obvious stuff that we all know. Sleep, rest, you know, the good old basics, a little bit of self-care. Hey, you know, that novel thing that we tend to forget about when we're looking after everyone else. Acts and rituals of remembrance. And this you can do, I mean, I'm talking probably mainly about death. However, acts of remembrance can be a good thing. If I've lost a relationship that is important to me, not a bad thing to think about back on the good things, right? Even if I've been in it, because it's so hard because of what I have lost. But at least I'm acknowledging what I've lost, right? So those rituals are good. And certainly I think for bereavement, rituals are always good. And what rituals? What works for us, right? But again, it's a way of acknowledging and sometimes sharing that acknowledgement with others. Right? Okay. Even if it's loss of my own dreams that actually I never told anyone else about, my own ritual could be, hey, I actually tell my best friend for a change, or I write myself a little letter about what I had dreamed. In other words, I could still do a ritual. It doesn't have to be a huge public thing, but a ritual can be good for, again, acknowledging that loss. So, okay. What else? What else to do? Ask for help. Expect the emotions to be a bit like this and for no reason. You know, why would they change? Why am I having a good day? Why am I having a bad day? It is what it is. You're going to do it your way. It may not be like any other loss you grieved. Do it your way, because you are you and no one else has ever experienced the exact thing that you're having right now. Good self-care, same old, same old. Reflect and wait before making major life decisions. Again, a lot of these things to me are very kind of obvious. They're stuff that we all actually know, but sometimes seeing it again can help us kind of, oh yeah, I think I should be doing that. So, because if you think of when we've suffered a loss, whether it's a loss of a job, a loss that we may consider smaller than, say, the loss of a spouse, you know, to death, or one of the worst that one can suffer, the loss of a child, it really puts us in a great state of disequilibrium, because really it's kind of thrown up everything in our life in a way that, you know, things are out of sync and will be for some time. So to make major decisions of any sort at that point is probably not a good thing. People talk about the magical, I've heard 6 months, a year, you know, wait that long. I don't think there are any hard and fast rules. I think it's just a matter of be a little cautious, because we may not be in a place to really be able to make a good decision for us about whatever the issue is. Okay, the don'ts. Isolation, not good. And of course that's the one thing we really want to do when we're feeling terribly sad. But you know, it's not good. Withdrawing back is a good thing, is usually healthy, but kind of cutting off everyone, probably not that healthy. Watch our own social habits, alcohol, drugs, even any meds we have from the doctor. If I'm taking a sleeping pill every night, maybe a bit of a red flag that I'm not doing very well. So, okay. Don't expect others to grieve the same way as we do. Same old, same old. We're all unique individuals. No time limit. I think this, to me, is one of the most important things in coming to terms with grief, is the fact that, unlike most conditions, this is not something that, to my mind, actually has an end. And I think that's where I have the biggest problem with the DAB model, as in when I get to acceptance, I'm there. No, because it's not something, where we've suffered a major loss, in some ways that loss becomes part of who we are and will actually be with us forever. Now that doesn't mean that we have to be in deep mourning or in a great state of unhappiness for the rest of our lives. But it does mean that it's not actually something we can say, I'm done with that. And I think that's an important consideration for us and for anyone we're trying to support. Because what could be over, and what everyone would hope would be over, is the extreme pain where we really are somewhat incapacitated. and where it's just too painful. Life is so hard, we can't see any joy, we can't actually live our normal life. That's pretty much when that's the grief where we need and want some support to actually get through that part. But the through is to a relative time of peace where we can have more hope and we can have joy and we're not overwhelmed every day. So, okay. No time limit. Do not beat yourself up in terms of how I should be doing better. I should have got over it. I should have this, I should have that. Don't should on yourself, as Virginia Satir famously said. Yeah. And don't let others tell you how it should be done. Because again, however well-intentioned they may be, they are not you. Okay. When to do the professional help? How am I doing? Oh, we're actually good. Okay, I think I've actually just said most of that. Yeah, you know, again, I think the decision to reach out for help, whether it's to your friend or your neighbor or your sister, the time is when it's too difficult to do what we're doing right now. And of course that will change when we're in grief. So that's the time to look for help. And the sort of help we could be looking for, and I don't think I've even got a slide on this, so sorry about that, is a lot of the issue with grief is not just the loss that we've suffered, but it's kind of what is life going to look like after this? And it's going to be different, whatever the loss is. So a lot of our distress can be not just, well, I'm missing Granny, but it's, what am I going to do on a Sunday when every Sunday I used to go to Granny's? How am I going to have someone who says you're wonderful all the time when Granny's not here to say that anymore? So a lot of the pain of grief is the loss, but it's what am I going to do with that void? Or how am I going to make my life enjoyable again? Okay. So a lot of the support that we may seek is about that part as well as the actual loss part. So it's past, current, and future we're looking at. Okay. Oh, okay. On to, this is the approach I use in dealing with grief. It's actually what I use in most of my work because I found that this works better than all the things I learned about in practice for 20 years before I encountered this. It's a practice called applied metapsychology. It has some similarities to other forms of counseling. It also has some significant differences. Okay, what shall I say about it? Person-centered, which is a big plus for me. In other words, it's all about what is this person feeling, where do they need to go, what do they identify as the problem, the concern. Structured, which is kind of like almost a contradiction from the person-centered. It's completely person-centered, but the tools we use in TIR, LSR, I should say them out, it's awful when people speak in acronyms, traumatic incident reduction and life stress reduction. The techniques we actually use to achieve the relief that people want are structured as in almost all of them consist of a set of questions that someone else thought up. So it's a little awkward when we, as practitioners, when we start using this approach because we're used to just talking to the person we're with, and here you're going to have a piece of paper here and you're going to be asking those questions. However, to my mind, the only reason to do this or any other approach is because it's effective. That's it. So it also is very empowering of the person who is the client because we're actually not doing a lot to them. We are simply asking questions and they are accessing their own innate wisdom in a way that's a lot easier for people to do than if you say, well, I'm sure you've got the answer in you. Well, yeah, if I did, I wouldn't be asking you, right? So, you know, it allows them to actually access that. It allows them to access material that is below their level of awareness currently, because otherwise if we had all the answers here, we wouldn't be needing help, right? So it's a psychodynamic roots theory, as in we've repressed things that are too painful or overwhelming. And particularly with something like grief, this is where we can do that kind of fast forward. You cannot do this stuff on your own. it's really great to do it with someone else. It externalizes our experience by talking about it out loud, but in a way, again, that goes beyond what we can do by talking to our friend. Okay, it's proven that it works, which is good, right? Handy. What else? Okay, person-centered, innate healing wisdom. So it's a very positive view of human beings, and I think there were a lot of heads nodding when we were talking about this earlier, about everyone's unique personal experience of grief or anything else. No one else knows exactly what we're feeling. So someone else telling us what to do or how to do it is not always that helpful. The broad guidelines I was giving earlier are great, but what is happening for the person that I'm talking to is actually way more important than anything that I think might be helpful. So it's a great way of retrieving repressed memory, and the whole point of retrieving that is because we're going to acknowledge that unfulfilled intention in a way that actually releases it with actually minimal effort on the part of either the client or the facilitator, the counselor, which is good in my opinion. So we talk about anything that kind of sticks to us as through life, losses, upsets, hurts, anything as being environmental garbage. In other words, it's not wrong with the person, it's kind of burdening them down. So getting rid of it allows them to simply flourish as the strong, healthy person they are. And the philosophy I find very appealing, because I do believe that about human beings, that we're all inherently good. And the bad stuff is just because of the stuff that's happened to us, the garbage. So, okay. So these are the techniques. I don't know if anyone's interested in hearing about them, but we choose different specific techniques depending on what the person is presenting. And in other words, if they say, what was awful to me in this loss was when I got that phone call saying grandma was in the hospital and she probably wouldn't make it, that's what's worrying me most. Bingo, I would use basic TIR because I'm dealing with that experience. As opposed to if she says, I just have this unbelievable gut-wrenching sadness, then I'm going to use a different technique because really what the person is concerned about is the feeling of sadness. Now the chances are, if that's what the feeling is, that it is about something more than this present loss. Because they say, well, I've actually been depressed for a couple of years now and it's kind of just got worse since my aunt passed. Well, and that's what I want to get rid of. I'm looking at a different technique. I put in there, one of them that I actually find very humbling to actually do with the client is this communication with a departed loved one, which is not about having a seance at all. Yeah, so I mean, anyone who does that, great if that's what you want to do, and I'm in no way putting that down, but it really is a very powerful way of someone actually communicating with a person who's no longer there. You can use the technique where the grief is about, you know, my friend that moved to a different city and I don't have the internet, it's probably my house. You know, so someone, for some reason I can't communicate with them anymore. Doesn't really work that much these days, does it? Yeah, it used to be. Okay, well, no, so someone who's ill, who's still alive, but who's ill to the point that I can't talk to. There we go, there's an example. So either it doesn't have to be someone who's actually dead to do this technique, but it's very, very powerful to experience and very powerful to witness. So, and sometimes I feel like I am conducting a seance when I do this because the person will almost always look at a spot in the room or a chair next to them as though the person is there, and will sometimes say they were there. So, but again, what is great is if they feel relief, and it's usually by the end of that session, well, we've done our job, both me and the client. The wrong indication I love because it's a fabulous little technique where people get an invalidation by someone significant. So again, in the case of grief, well, you know, you lost that job 2 years ago, get over it. Well, that's an invalidation. That's saying I'm not doing a good job with my loss. That's putting me down. And again, the intention may be I'm helping you just, you know, shake yourself up and off you go. If it's not working for me, that can actually create another level of distress for me by that put down. And we can correct those fairly easily. So, okay. And the unblocking is just a great pull out the stuff, whatever it is, around that. So, for example, if someone says, well, I'm grieving, and it was just a blur that month when he went into hospital, and then, you know, in other words, there's a whole lot of stuff. It's a long time period. I'd probably use a technique like unblocking. Yeah, Lois.
Thematic.
Yeah.
You've got depression or anger. What about anxiety?
Yes. Yeah. It's fabulous. It's absolutely my go-to for any, you know, and again, I'm sort of been talking mainly about grief, but anxiety, it's a great one for that. Because, and I mean, I can get into the theory if anyone's interested, but basically it comes from somewhere. Again, none of us are naturally anxious, depressed, angry. You know how people say, oh, well, you know, it runs in my family or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be a natural condition for anyone, I don't believe. It does result from what the environment gives us, and it can be undone, which is great. So, yeah. Okay, I think, oh goodness, I think I've talked too fast, or you've all been so quiet and rapt. So, yeah, just some resources. Some for very specific things. Hospice, of course, is for death. Center for Loss is a great generic loss site. TCF is a very specific one that I've put in there, maybe because my own family were touched by this, is the loss of a child. And great, it's an international organization and a really good resource. This is on your handout sheet, these, because I thought this was one thing people would really want to have. So, and then of course, if you're looking for a counselor, BCACC, we've got about 6,000 of us throughout the province. And Counselling BC is another site which is great for looking for not only RCCs, but psychologists and social workers and other people qualified in this field. So, yeah. So I think that's everything I wanted to say. Yeah, that's it. There's the thank you and the bow.
We'll open it up for questions in just a second. We want to give you this as a token of our appreciation.